They turned off the sun, and it never turned back on. In 2087, they turned off the sun for 1 hour, and it never turned back on. They called it a pause, a necessary breath for a fevered world. Satellites were synchronized, fusion stations idled, and fleets of mirror kites unfolded like bright petals between Earth and its star. Across the planet, people gathered on rooftops and beaches and mountains because the planners had said it would be beautiful, and because beauty felt like permission. The countdown fell toward 0, and somewhere over the Pacific, a soft command whispered into the void. At 9 o'clock, Coordinated Universal Time, the light thinned like a thought being forgotten. Shadows lost their edges. Color drained from leaves and faces. Birds went silent. The ocean stopped glittering and became a sheet of iron. The sun dimmed to an ember and then to a bruise, and then to nothing at all. Noon looked like midnight, but not even midnight was this empty. This was the missing of a heartbeat. People tried to cheer. Someone kissed someone. A child shouted at the sky as if it were a stage where the hero would run back on any moment. On the International Space Station, the crew floated at the portholes, whispering, counting, waiting for the golden knife of dawn to cut the black again. In control rooms, the numbers scrolled and the models reassured. 1 hour, everything said. 60 minutes, a world holding its breath together. At 10 o'clock Coordinated Universal Time, the clocks chimed and the scripts changed. And the sun did not. Alarms flowered in green and red and then died when the grids tripped. The ocean winds swelled as temperature gradients stumbled and stumbled again. Far to the north, a sheaf of aurora came down like the hem of a dress and touched the deeps with cold fingers. It was beautiful for perhaps 30 seconds more. And then the first satellite went out. Then the second. Then all the tiny voices that made Earth feel bigger than herself vanished one by one like candles in a long corridor. There are images, still in the archives. A wedding party on the Bosphorus turning their faces to the empty sky. A hospital in Nairobi wrapping newborns in heated blankets and singing to keep their hands steady. An Argentinian farmer setting a field alight, because he had been told smoke would trap heat near the ground and he would not let the frost take his oranges without a fight. The great cities dimmed in ragged sequences, not all at once, like giants drowsing and finally sleeping. When the wind found its voice again, it sounded like grief, and yet in the hollow people moved. They made lines of cars into caravans and caravans into communities. They filled bathtubs and shared them and laughed because even laughter was a kind of light. They broke open museums and took the paintings that looked warmest and hung them in bunkers. They lit every candle. They told every story. The planet cooled by degrees. The first winter never ended. But humanity did not end with it. A generation after the Black Hour, the cities were underground and the old highways were tunnels of frost. Children learned under lamps with spectra cut to mimic the old sun. On their birthdays they were brought to the surface and shown the sky, which was a cathedral of stars so dense it made them cry. They were told the sun had gone away because of a project, and that the project had failed, and that failure did not mean we stop. All over the world, engines hummed in caverns and heat piped through ribbed corridors. People became pale and clever and stubborn. They made greenhouses that pulsed like lungs and filled them with wheat and algae. They printed vitamin D into gummies that tasted like mangoes. They built 1,000 lighthouses where power and food and music gathered, and on their doors they carved the words, "There is enough for you," in the city called Meridian. beneath the ruins of old Marrakesh, where sand had hardened to glass, a woman named Mara grew up chasing the steam trails of pipes and the rumors of older, warmer days. Her father repaired pressure seals. Her mother cleaned the archive's memory arrays with a brush made from her own hair. When Mara was 8, she sneaked into the archive's listening chamber and lay on the floor and felt the earth thrumming with turbines. When she was 12, she asked the director if she could learn to read the old science. When she was 15, she found a footnote that would change her life. The document was a maintenance log from the solar dimming project. Jargon and timetables and thermometer tables until a technician had added a note in a margin. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. The line said this: "The sun obeys, but it listens first." She copied the sentence and put it above her bed and asked every elder scientist what it meant. Some said it was a metaphor. Some said it was a glitch note. Some said do not dwell. Mara dwelled. She learned the physics of coronal plasma and the language of magnetohydrodynamics and the history of vanity. She ran models in borrowed minutes at the back of the daylight servers and came to believe in a possibility that was sacrilegious and breathtaking in equal measure. She wrote it down and whispered it to the turbo, so their sighing would not carry the thought into anyone else's ears. Perhaps we did not turn off the sun. Perhaps we asked it to turn away. She built her life on 3 pillars. First, that humanity could survive as long as it needed. To this end, she taught children to be tender and engineers to share wrenches and elders to tell stories out loud. Second, that the sun was not an instrument, but a partner. To this end, she learnt music, because there are conversations in the universe that cannot be held in numbers alone. Third, that one day she would go looking, when the Meridian Council finally opened the vaults and counted their fuel. They chose to build not a city, but a ship. They named it Heliosong because the ship's frame was a harp and its engines were lungs and its mission was persuasion. Every lighthouse sent copper and carbon and patience. Every child cut paper suns and pasted them to the shipyard walls. Every mechanic polished every bolt until it reflected a face that had not seen daylight since childhood. The keel laid down was a prayer you could knock with a knuckle. Mara led the signal corps. She chose 10 voices to be the hearts of the choir. She asked an old orbital pilot named Cato to teach them how to be small in space and a poet named Soraya to teach them how to be large. She commissioned an instrument no one had ever played, a lattice of superconducting threads that could be plucked by magnetic fields and would hum at frequencies that resonated with the sun's skin. She called it the Corona Harp. The children called it the Star Guitar and made songs about it that ran through the tunnels for months. On the day Heliosong rose, Meridian emptied. People climbed to the surface, wrapped in polar silk, and stood in the killing air with warm stones in their pockets to watch as a needle of black and silver cut free from the mountain. The engines burned pale and steady. The ship climbed through air that did not move and into a sky that was crowded with stars. And for a moment the old satellites glinted like confetti. The ground crews listened until the carrier wave thinned, and then they turned back underground to keep the lamps burning. Heliosong passed the old orbital, graveyards where panels drifted like fallen leaves. It threaded the belt of mirror kites that had once sipped sunlight and now were knives of black glass. It fired on microfusion pulses, steady as a slow drumbeat. In the observation blister, Mara pressed her hand to the window and tried to imagine heat that was not borrowed. Cato floated beside her with his boots off and his ash-grey hair floating like a question. He said, softly, that once upon a time the sun had been too bright to look at. She said she would like to try. They reached the orbit where the dimming regulators had stood in proud formation 40 years before. The ring was broken and the interface towers drifted, their cords snaking like seaweed in a black ocean. Heliosong latched to the least wrecked of them and breathed into its lungs. The old screens flickered and showed numbers, and then showed a message that transit through time had not erased. The words were simple, uncapitalized, infuriating. Waiting for query, Mara sent the old command to restore. It returned an error and a shape. The error said permission declined. The shape looked like a waveform with a smile. Soraya laughed and cried at once. Kato closed his eyes and whispered a curse like a toast. Mara put her palm on the corona harp and felt it buzz under her fingers. She tuned it until the ship's steel vibrated in sympathy. Then she took a breath and said hello. The first reply was not a word. It was an ache in the gums, a pressure in the ears, a low, warm wash through the chest. It felt like the way a camp feels when someone opens a door and heat spills out around your knees. The choir pulled their harnesses tight and began to sing. They did not sing as humans sing to comfort each other, though sometimes those melodies leaked in. They sang with fields and currents and coherent noise. They hummed in radio and in magnetic froth. They shaped sound like a riverbed shapes water and then stepped back and let it run. The ship trembled. The regulators bobbed like dead buoys waking up. The waveforms on the old screens became flowers opening and closing. Stories will say Mara spoke to the sun as if to a god. The archive records show she spoke to it like to an animal at a forest's edge, patient and without sudden movements. She told it what had happened. She told it what it felt like to be 10 and cold and wondering whether yellow was real. She told it what it felt like to be 40 and needed and unafraid. She apologized for the arrogance that had addressed it as a thermostat. She offered a different address: companion, neighbor, elder fire. The reply came in beats that the coronographs turned into colors and the colors into syllables. It said, "You asked me to be less, and you did not consider that I know myself." It said I was not extinguished. I turned away, the way a face turns away from a hand that means to pinch. It said you are small and noisy, and I have watched you dance. It said if you will learn, I will listen. Learning took time, measured not in hours, but in wake cycles and frozen fuel lines and the pace at which bones thin in microgravity. Heliosong circled and sang. On Earth, the greenhouses tightened their belts and the lighthouses rationed. Music first because it seemed right to hurt where joy lived rather than where oxygen did. Meridian sent up poems in tight little packets of data shaped like seeds. When the ship's hydroponic lettuce bolted and tasted like paper, they ate it anyway as if chewing obedience would make patience easier. Mara assembled a curriculum of humility. She asked the ocean to record the language of its waves before and after the black,